Hello, everyone. I'm Edeline Lee, and it gives me so much pleasure to welcome you, along with Fenwick of Bond Street, to the 5th of our Women and Power speaker series. 5 years ago, we presented our Autumn-Winter 2019 show at London Fashion Week, inspired by Mary Beard's Woman and Power. As I make clothes to dress women in their power, I came to the realization that perhaps the fashion stage was an opportunity to listen to, rather than only look at, women. Thus, the original show was presented as a 2-hour marathon of 35 powerful women orators of all disciplines. You can view that show on our YouTube channel. This evening, I have the privilege of introducing you to the dynamo that is Nancy Durrant, critic, broadcaster, and the culture editor of the Evening Standard, in conversation with author Reni Eddo-Lodge. Reni's debut book, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, was published in 2017 to critical acclaim. It is a multiple award-winning Sunday Times and New York Times bestseller that recently celebrated 1 million copies sold. Reni, I cannot wait to listen to you and Nancy speak, so I turn the stage over to you.
Thank you, Edeline.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much for coming. I'm really, really excited to be talking to Reni this evening. So we're gonna talk through some of the themes in her amazing book, which I think you all have a copy of, which in the bag, which is really great, and a bit about some of the way that she was thinking when she was writing, and then we'll open to questions after a while. So Reni, in 2014, just in case any of you don't know this, Reni wrote a blog post entitled "Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race," and it, suffice to say, it had quite a dynamic response. So Reni, I wondered if you would just talk a bit about the writing of that blog post, how you were feeling, and what spurred you to write it.
Sure. I mean, I think I did not come to that conclusion, out of the blue. It was a conclusion that I drew after attempting to do exactly that for some time. But me being me, I'm not a gently kind of conversator. And these spaces that I was in where I was trying to have these conversations, not about race in the abstract, but racism in the present, and kind of like how it showed up in our society. And the spaces that I was in were activist circles, in circles of people who were wanting to make the world better, fairer place for women in particular, feminist circles. And, in those circles, everybody had a reference point for what feminism was, and sexism and misogyny, and why these things were not good, and and how these things showed up in society, from girlhood to being a teen, to a parent, to being in your old age. And I think it was disappointing in those circles to try and have conversations about how racism showed up in the world. And actually, I think it got quite acrimonious. So by the time that I had actually wrote that blog post, I was essentially making a commitment to myself that I'm not going to do this anymore. The second line of the blog post is not all white people, just the vast majority who refuse to accept the legitimacy of structural racism and its symptoms, right? And when I was in those circles, I was surrounded by women who were like, sexism is bad, but, racism either exists but isn't a priority in this space because we're only talking about sexism here, or that it doesn't exist at all, and raising this is just you're doing this to divide the movement or aggravate people. And I think in feminist spaces, the claim to want to advocate on behalf of women in general, when you boil that down to its practice, if you're not willing to talk about other ways in which women are affected by, let's say, structural discrimination, then you're actually just doing that work on behalf of some women who perhaps are only affected by sexism and misogyny, but aren't affected by other factors, right? So I'd been having those conversations, and I was like, it's actually time to stop. And the thing that actually prompted me to want to stop, and I tell this story, and it often sounds strange, but basically there was a group that I was involved in sent a film round, the email list at the time. It was called The Colour of Fear, directed by a man named Lee Man-wha. And it was, an early 90s sort of documentary film that Oprah had, for some reason, decided to give a spotlight on her show back then at the time. So it kind of had like this cult underground status. And in this film, it was all men. It was majority men of color. There was a couple of East Asian men. There were some black men. This was all in America, by the way, so it wasn't a British film. And then there were two white men in the group. And I think the director had tasked them with the job of discussing racism in the group for the film. That was the task. And over the 2 hours, you saw these incredible dynamics sort of come to pass. The director tasked first the men in the room who are not white to discuss what racism means to them, how it shows up in their lives. And this is at a time when the men were saying, listen, I'm getting followed around shops. They're basically speaking not to the big statistics, but to their personal experience of how racism shows up in their lives. And then, I don't know if this is like a spoiler of the film or whatnot, but so the two white men in the group.
We're all desperate to watch it.
I mean, it's really difficult to find. So
Good, it sounds awful.
back then, it was like, it was being, like I say, it became an underground cult classic. So the two white men in the group, one of them was very open to hearing about these experiences, but the other one was just in a state of rigid denial. And he really refused to engage in any, like the defenses were up to a point where he basically, to paraphrase, I'm not directly quoting him, but he basically was saying that the people speaking about racism in the group were lying and was reaching for various different reasons as to why they would experience the world like that largely pointed to their own deficiencies. So I viewed these dynamics, and then I came to a realization that I had experienced that level of denial, and that actually those defenses were so difficult to get past that for the sake of my own sanity, it was best to stop, and that's why that second line is not all white people, just the vast majority who refuse to accept the legitimacy of structural racism and its symptoms. So I wrote this blog post, and it was really a promise to myself. I've always written, I've always been a writer. And in that blog post, I was articulating a boundary for myself to not do it anymore. And what I tried to do in it was really find the words for what encountering that level of defense really feels like. I wrote the words, it's like their eyes shut down and you can see the ears closing. Do you know what I mean? That's what I was trying to really articulate. And so I pressed publish on this blog post. And what was immediately apparent to me is that description of seeing someone's defenses go up was very, very common because it very much took on a life of its own very quickly.
Right. And then, so can you just talk a little bit about the response to it? Because you write about that in the book and kind of you being slightly taken aback about who responded to it and how.
Sure. So, I press publish and it quickly picks up momentum, kind of like, that caricature of a snowball picking up snow and getting bigger and bigger. And I think very quickly, because at that point I was involved in a kind of a smallish, like London-based, like feminist community. There were some people who picked up on that, but also, I'm not quite sure. I mean, you never know when something that today we call it going viral, right? We don't know exactly what it is that resonates or chimes with people or how it gets out as far as it does. I just know that today, almost a decade later, I've had the privilege of traveling the world with this work. And in every country, I always meet somebody who says, I remember reading that when you published it back in 2014. Wherever I am in the world, somebody will always tell me. I think that me going to those great pains to just try to describe that, witnessing the defences go up, like watching the gates close, I think it really resonated with a lot of people. And as it resonated with a lot of people and they shared it with their friends, it was then also getting through to their white friends, And then I'd be having, white readers be in touch and say things like, I've never heard it described like this before, Yeah.
And I mean, it's true. I have to say, when Reni's writing is the blog post particularly was not written for me. It wasn't written for anyone like me. It was written effectively for you, wasn't it, to sort of crystallize? But it crystallizes so brilliantly so many things that, when you've had those conversations with people and you're like, I just want to, maybe someone from the older generation or whatever, and you're like, I just want to be able to explain to you why what you're saying isn't right. It's such a fantastic tool to Reni's book to kind of help crystallize those ideas. It's so great. Anyway,
I mean, what I will say is that outside of that conversation around politics, I think everybody's experienced seeing that sort of gates closed moment in another human being in relationships. It can be outside of politics. It can be about anything. A point where you're trying to just articulate an experience or how something is affecting you, and you find yourself discussing it with somebody who simply doesn't want to believe you, So I think what I was trying to reach for in that blog post was the phenomenon of a kind of like a lack of curiosity about another human being's experience, how it feels like to be on the receiving end of that, and, really trying to detail how I was going to try and protect myself from being on the receiving end of that in the future. Because in that moment, I can't, with time, I really think about how, these kind of, that conversation that I was discussing is about human relationships, and, part of human relationships is trying to connect with another human being on a basic emotional level, right? And I was explaining the phenomenon of what happens when something gets in the way. And that something in that instance was racism, but there's so many other things that can get in the way of, being able to connect, right? And I think a lot more people than I anticipated had felt that.
Yeah, and you were asked to write the book based on it.
Not so much. No? It was kind of a bit more...
Bit more complicated than that?
Yeah, I mean, I was a writer. I was trying to make my way in British journalism. I was trying to make a career for myself, and it didn't really happen. Not directly, but what ended up happening was off the back of that piece of writing, people sort of sat up a bit more, paid attention to my work. I was put on a few 30 under 30 lists, ended up being commissioned to write something for the New York Times off the back of that, So it was never as simple as, oh, this excellent piece of writing, here, have a book deal. It was very much just, it happened relatively quickly.
Yeah.
But, actually the literary agent who reached out saying, have you ever thought about writing a book, didn't even know about the blog post.
Oh.
Had no idea about my speciality, about what I wrote about, what I was passionate about. And actually, when I went away and came up with a bit of proposal and said, I want to base it around this piece of writing that I've done, he was like, oh, maybe you want to tone it down. So it really wasn't as simple as, okay, book deal based on that.
Right, okay. And what did you, when you write about the post and talk about who it was for, then writing the book, because, since you say this in the book, since you wrote it, essentially you've done so much talking to white people about race, and it's kind of it's a sort of is that a positive thing now? Is it that kind of, what did you want to achieve with the book specifically?
The the aim of the book was very simple. It was to change the way that we are thinking and talking about racism in Britain, full stop, And I wrote in the book, in a follow-up sort of afterword, that I now spend a lot of time speaking to white people about race. But actually, what I'm doing is speaking to people who are open, right? Not necessarily all white. There's plenty of people who I find myself talking to or in conversation with who deeply resonate with that feeling of watching the defences go up, right? And so I don't want to give the impression, although I think it may be an impression that I've crafted myself, unfortunately, about I'm going around giving anti-racism seminars or consulting people or anything like that. All I'm doing is continuing to talk about the work for as long as I suppose the demand is there. But the aim also of the book was to not just change that conversation, but to get to the nub of that denial dialogue that I spoke about at the top of our conversation, which is to prove the fundamentals of that denial, which is that racism exists in this country, and here is how.
Yeah.
Here are some examples how, you know. So what I tried to do when I was writing it was really just draw on research, go through archives, and do a little bit of original reporting as well. But I explained in that blog post that I think what was happening in that exchange is that I often found myself speaking to somebody from a completely different reference point. I would have knowledge about colonialism that was inherent in who I am because I'm from a country that was formerly colonized. Do you know what I mean? And I often find myself speaking to somebody who perhaps didn't know the extent of what the British Empire did to the rest of the world, So I was sometimes speaking to somebody with a completely different reference point on the basic facts of like race and racism, let alone my own personal experience,
Yeah.
So really what I was trying to do with this book was do some writing around the basic facts. So like everyone can look at the facts and draw their own conclusions, but sometimes I found myself speaking to people who didn't have a grasp of the basic facts. So that's really what I was trying to do with it.
Right. And I wanted to ask you about that. So I won't take you through chapter by chapter, but there is an early one. I think the first chapter is histories, and it sort of recounts some of the hidden or partially concealed black histories in Britain, which, as you say, an awful lot of people don't know. And I think that's because we're not told about them in our education. And I wondered if you could talk a bit about those histories, about the way that they've been hidden in the education system, because it's very much a kind of live debate at the moment, isn't it? Like how much people think of as extra information we should be adding to the teaching that we have at the moment.
Yeah, sure. So I think a really strong example of that is, I write about in the book how my reference points for what Black history was as a young Black person growing up in Britain was informed by a British education system who, when it came to Black History Month, started talking about what was happening with African Americans, which I can't think of like other areas of history in particular where in Britain we just completely divest from local and national and like, well, let's look over there. Do you know what I mean?
Like, don't look there. Don't just
so
over there.
A clear example for that is that I was in my early 20s and working for a charity that focused specifically on challenging racism when I learned about the Bristol bus boycott, which happened around the same time that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was giving his I Have a Dream speech, It was led by 3 Black men in Bristol, and they were responding to a circumstance in which there was essentially a colour bar on Bristol's bus network. So you could apply for a job if you were Black, and a lot of the Black people in Bristol at the time, it had a fairly big Black population, and because of colonisation, people like Black people who were coming to Britain, and in their mind it was the mother country because they were coming from like the West Indies, and to some extent, their passports, had the Queen on them. Do you know what I mean? So they'd have names that were very anglicised, right? Because of that history, they'd apply for the jobs, and then when they turn up for the interview, they would be told, "I'm very sorry, but the vacancy is filled." And because the black community was small enough for word to get around, people suddenly realised, hang on a minute, they're still advertising for the job, but when me, so-and-so and so-and-so went to go and interview for it, they said that, the vacancy was filled. So 3 black men, led by a man named Paul Stevenson, essentially created a citywide protest and encouraged people to stop using the bus network at all until that was rectified.
Yep.
And that happened around the same time as the history that, as me as a child learnt, that was happening in America. And so when I sat down to write this book, I thought, not only do I need to write about the Bristol bus boycott, how it happened, who led it and whatnot, I also need to do some serious thinking about why is it, when it comes to these conversations about civil rights in Britain, it feels more comfortable to reach for those stories from America rather than what's actually happened under our noses? And what is the knock-on effect of that? Because I know for a fact that the knock-on effect that I experienced was, again, it's that point about reference points. I'd often be speaking with people who would be like, well, that's not really an issue here. Like, it's in America where it's seriously an issue. And part of that issue of reference points is that they didn't know about it.
Yeah.
They literally didn't know there had been similar civil rights struggles in Britain. They had no idea that in Liverpool, at the turn of the 20th century, a black man had been lynched. They had no idea, So these are things that, and I know it's all like difficult history to hear about, but we are open to learning that history when it comes to civil rights struggles overseas. So for me, that's just a really clear example of how, that's the longer that hole is sort of skipped over in terms of what we all understand and what all our reference points are, then what actually happens is that when we all get a little bit older, that's when the denial comes in, because I can't blame somebody who doesn't know something for not knowing it, right?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? That kind of... I heard someone, I think I told you this the other day, a politician talking about changes in the education system and describing the introduction of acknowledgement of things that the British Empire had done that were perhaps not entirely delightful as being anti-British, which I just found so extraordinary. It's such a kind of... It's like that shuts things down so effectively, doesn't it? That kind of rhetoric.
I just think that, increasingly, I feel like I was a child who was, like, on a state level, denied the education that I needed to understand the society that I lived in, and I think that's shocking. And I think that what's happening now with young people is that they're looking for that level of understanding to help them understand the world that they live in today, And I'm not sure I don't think it's anti-British to help people understand why things are the way they are. I mean, I grew up in a time of hearing "go back to your own country," which I think, again, leads to that lack of reference point. That is a very generous reading, by the way, of that phrase. But I always thought it was strange that phrase would be like leveled at like black and Asian people in Britain. It just speaks to a complete lack of understanding of like empire and why black and brown people are here in Britain in the first place. I mean, there's this quote from the founder of the Institute of Race Relations, and it's, "We are here because you were there," and to me, it was astounding the amount of people who hadn't grasped that Britain was there, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I wanted to ask you a bit about representation. So there's an incredibly kind of sad moment in the book where you describe this thing that you say to your mother when you're small, with the kind of beautiful but brutal logic of a small child, when you ask her, when am I going to turn white? Because the people that you see on TV, the good ones, are always white. And it feels to me very much like the representation of people of colour on telly and in film has come on leaps and bounds, but I mean, like literally in the last 5 or 10 years, which is really not very many. But I wondered what your impression was, and also I wondered if you could talk a bit about the importance of seeing people on screen who look like you, and particularly for a young person.
Sure. I mean, I was a big reader as a child. And so, I was constantly submerged in fictional characters' interior lives, and all these fictional characters were white. So I think I very quickly came to the conclusion that, okay, well, people with consciences are white, are they not? Until I'm proven otherwise. And it's the same with, engaging in children's television and whatnot. I think now, I'm not sure how much I can speak for myself at 3 or 4 years old, but it's, to me, that really speaks to what that level of marginalization can do to a psyche. I'm not the first person to have written about this. I think, Frantz Fanon writes about it beautifully, like that concept of double consciousness of, inhabiting a body that is basically designated as other. So seeing and understanding all of the logic around you being other, whilst also being in that body, right? I think that, I have to say, my position has changed somewhat. While I recognize that representation in fictional stories is important for that exact reason, I'm starting to feel that it's not the top priority right now.
Right.
Also, I think that those leaps and bounds that have come on in the last 5 to 10 years is because people in creative communities like to think of themselves as the good guys. So as soon as these arguments really hit the ground running, people who are involved in storytelling went about attempting to rectify, attempting to correct.
Yeah.
And to some extent, I think that level of correction is not a bad thing if it means that less Black children will find themselves asking that question in the future. But right now, I feel like it's not the burning building.
Right. How would you describe the burning building?
I think our political situation is the burning building. I think, what we've got now is a kind of a split between our popular culture and our political leadership. And while our popular culture is going out of its way to try and rectify what years and years of marginalization have done to the public imagination, that's all very well and good, but if people's material conditions are still difficult, are still tough, if you're born if in Britain, if you are born Black or Asian, you're still likely to be born into poverty, more likely to, not to say that all Black and Asian people are, but if the big picture shows that that's still the case, then we need, the political situation to address that level of marginalization is, to me, now that's the burning building. And right now we have political leadership who not only couldn't care less and it's not a priority, but they're actually openly hostile. That's concerning to me.
Yeah.
Because even though they might try to engage in it with culture war rhetoric, at the end of the day, these are people's lives. And we are going into a situation where, a cost of living crisis and, is going to make people who already experience that harsh level of economic marginalization, which, my research and reporting showed that what it means to be working class in this country is it's the most multicultural, the interest rates, the gas prices, all of that is going to hit people who are already experiencing some level of marginalization. It's going to hit them even harder. So to me, that's a burning building.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because there's a new chapter in the 2022 edition of the book, which Reni's written, and it takes in the events of the last 3 years, I think, isn't it? And one of the things that it talks about, that she talks about in it, is the events in Bristol when the statue of Edward Colston was taken down by protesters, and that's a really interesting. I'd love to talk to you about that, but referring to what you were just saying, there was a report that came out just after that was initiated just after those events, that was supposed to be an exploration, I think, into race and ethnic disparities in Britain. That's correct, isn't it?
By the government.
By the government. And in the end, that was hugely disappointing, wasn't it?
Yeah, because, the aim of it was to capitalise on that energy of 2020, and the report went out of its way to say that there are race and ethnic disparities in Britain exist, but not for racism. Racism is absolutely not the reason. That's what the report said, basically. It went out of its way to find every reason possible, apart from racism, for those disparities. And that's why it was really panned by experts.
Yeah.
And not just experts in the anti-racism space, who the report's authors would never listen to anyway.
Yeah.
But we're talking about people who work on public health, sort of like unions for people who work in public services, social workers, nurses. It was universally panned. And I think that really tells you that the level of ideology driving the government right now. I mean, we've all just seen it in the last 2 weeks. How again,
It's been eventful.
Ideology is more important than the material conditions that we're all in. Don't know if any of you lot have a mortgage about to be renewed. So again, I think that's a really clear example of how ideology actually supersedes the real life circumstances of people. Obviously those events of 2020, it was about one man's murder, but what it coalesced into is lots of people saying the circumstances in which this can happen are unjust and we don't want to see them anymore.
Yeah.
It would, of course, be amazing to see political leadership stand up and say, we are going to address those circumstances. But it didn't happen.
Well, there was a very interesting bit in that chapter about backlash, about everybody getting, those particularly young people, but not only young people, just really saying what it is that they want and the changes that they want, and making it very, very clear what they don't find acceptable and what they would like to change. And yet this report came out and it was effectively nonsense. But could you just explain the bit about the bubonic plague? Because I think it's a really good example of the kind of psychology of how it works. But you were at the gym listening to a podcast, I think, about the bubonic plague and about.
I don't know if I can quote it directly without the book in front of me.
I'm not going to test you. It's okay. But it was somebody, I think. I'll try and. I was reading it yesterday, but there was. I think it was about the changes that happened after the bubonic plague in Europe. Lots and lots of peasants, because that's what they were effectively treated as in that period, were wiped out, and then and lots of middle classes, and then. But the ground was still fertile, so they still needed people to work the land, but there were fewer people to work the land, and so the people who were prepared to work the land were like, well, we'd quite like some better conditions, thanks very much, because there's fewer of us, and we are therefore a commodity. And so then there was a backlash against it by the upper classes. I think that's vaguely what it was.
Yeah. Well, can somebody pass me a book? Thank you. I feel like, because right now, basically what I was trying to do was talk about the conditions of the pandemic and how the conditions of the pandemic, swung the balance of power, right? And that was unfortunately because of mass deaths. Okay, let me see if I can find it. Bear with me. I'm going to read it out.
I think it's at the top left of one of the pages, where you're at the bit where you're at the gym.
Okay, here we go. The day after my second coronavirus vaccination, I was on a treadmill listening to an episode of the podcast Planet Money. I don't know if anyone listens to that. It's by NPR. The subject matter had me hooked. We were in a tentative spot in the pandemic, outside of lockdown, but still cautious. The episode was about the aftermath of the first wave of the bubonic plague. In the 14th century, this vicious disease had swept through Europe at exponential speed. It was highly contagious, passing from country to country via fleas that lived on rats that had sneaked onto trading ships. The bubonic plague's impact was devastating. With no clear explanation for the disease, some even took to whipping themselves and others in the hope of earning God's forgiveness. Anti-Semitic conspiracy theories about the cause of the plague led to the massacre of thousands of Jewish people. Violence, fear, and theft ruled the day. Society collapsed and millions of people died. It was, by all accounts, a horrifying time to be alive. And it was, of course, incomparable to the coronavirus. With modern-day medicine and the speed of the international scientific community, the situation we faced was completely different. But I'd clicked on the episode because I'd remembered wondering, in those early days of the pandemic, what kind of world we might step out into once the lockdowns were over. With its focus on economics, Planet Money took the long view, offering an analysis of the plague's effects on the economy. The plague destroys human capital. That is to say, it destroys human beings. Anne McCants, a historian at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, said on the podcast. But it does not destroy physical capital. You know, good farmland, the crop may rot in the field for 1 or 2 years, but if the land was fertile before, it's going to be fertile again. Huge swathes of Europe's poorest died, leaving an indelible dent in the workforce. But the farmland still needed its workers. So, as the plague subsided, with fewer labourers to go round, those who survived found themselves in an unprecedented position. They asked their bosses for better pay and working conditions. They could finally earn enough money to buy land and build property. They clothed themselves in the finest silks. Things that were once only accessible to noblemen and landed gentry were now available to those once considered inferior. Peasants, whose occupations were once determined by the families they were born into, could move freely from trade to trade. With their newfound wealth, they could begin to eat protein from slaughtered livestock instead of just grain. The widespread tragedy of the plague transformed the workforce, tipping the balance of power in favour of the poorest. But this new power was not welcomed by the establishment. Sumptuary laws, dictating levels of expenditure, had been around since the Roman era, but often weren't enforced. Yet during this time period, they were leveraged with the intention of curtailing the power of this new middle class. These laws imposed restrictions on what they could eat and what they could wear. This is a moment in history, said NPR's Keith Romer, where this economic change starts to feel like it's threatening the social order in this fundamental way. Romer's conclusion winded me. I had to stop the treadmill and take a moment to reflect. I realised that I'd been numbing myself to Britain's response to its racial reckoning. The backlash had been too difficult to watch. I've always been too earnest for my own good, and I couldn't bear to witness a movement so close to my heart being ridiculed, mischaracterised, and slandered. But when I heard Keith Romer's conclusion on the economic aftermath of the bubonic plague, everything began to make sense. In the huge amount of public support that they had gained for advocating for a just society, anti-racists had fundamentally threatened the social order. More people than ever could see the inequality around them. Gramophones had exposed the cruelty of state violence. Years of organising had created the solid foundations for a mass movement, vastly expanding the number of Britons sympathetic to the cause. We were winning the argument, and the establishment seemed to consider this an emergency. There we go.
This feels rather like a question to ask at the end of the conversation, but I don't know how close we are to that, actually. But I'd like to know the answer. Do you well, I sort of feel like I know the answer now that you said that, but in your view, is Britain in a better place in terms of its attitude to race than it was in 2014, or not, and why?
Well, I think, jumping off the back of that extract of the new chapter, what we're now witnessing is a level of curtailing of this movement. There is a movement that I think lots of ordinary people who haven't necessarily found themselves involved in, activism before, what's actually happened is that hearts and minds have changed. I think many hearts and minds in the British public. But what we're actually now seeing is those people whose hearts and minds have been changed are in their society, talking to their friends, talking to their family, trying to change their workplace, perhaps seeing things that they haven't seen before. And we are witnessing a level of efforts to curtail that.
Right.
I think what's happening in the cultural sector with museums and galleries in terms of who the government appoints to chair boards is very interesting. The government is going to great lengths because, of course, a cultural sector with museums and galleries, much like the creativity of people who make TV or write books, tends to comes to these conversations early. So we're actually seeing the government with their appointments trying to shut that down, trying to squeeze out people who might be interested in anti-racism. I think the other day it was reported that the government is trying to stop certain speakers speak to civil servants as well. So we're actually seeing that is what I'm trying to describe when I'm talking about that backlash, But I think fundamentally that so many hearts and minds have changed is undoubtedly a good thing, I think that what I always wanted to do with this book was try and move our points of reference, move the needle on what we all understood to be racism. And I think I come from this school of thought, right? I call it the James Baldwin school of thought, which is that I don't think ill of people, I just think they don't know. I don't think that people are malicious. I just think that they don't know, and that if people knew the extent of how racism shaped the world we lived in, then they'd understand.
Yeah.
Now I think it's a little bit naive, but that is basically still my my position.
It's a good place to start from, at least, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so.
Hoping that people will be good, because that tends to encourage them to be good, at least.
You'd find yourself being very pessimistic otherwise, wouldn't you? And I'm on this earth for a good while longer yet, so I don't see the need to feel too pessimistic.
You wrote in the new chapter about your feelings, your complicated, difficult feelings about the book becoming so suddenly successful and reaching the 1 million copies mark. And the reason it reached the 1 million copies mark is because of all the terrible things that were happening in the US in 2020. Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd. And can you look now back at and see the book as a positive contribution to a terrible time?
Yeah, I think I always think it was a positive contribution, and I'm glad that I wrote a piece of work that people feel that they can use as a tool, use as a reference point when the world is a frightening place and people are seeking to understand. But I'm never going to be at peace with the fact that my personal professional success came off the back of a time of great trauma for people. I'm never going to feel great about that,
Fair.
But also I think it's when it hurtled to the top of the charts in 2020. This wasn't out of the blue. I think the book had this dedicated group of readers who were strong advocates for it, and that had been the case. By 2020, it had been published for about 3 years.
Yeah.
So that had been, when it reached to the top of the charts, that was entirely people power. There was no publicist, there was no marketing spend to make it.
That would have been pretty awful.
Yeah, it would have been.
It?
I mean, I still have some strong feelings about anti-racist books that were put out that year. I just don't think that a person should seek to capitalize on, that level of grief and trauma, right? But that people power, that readers sort of using the book as a way to try and explain the moment, I think that was an amazing thing, and I'm glad that I contributed to the conversation in that way.
Yeah, in a positive way. I just wanted to ask one more thing, really, which is just to sort of bring the conversation up to date. This week has been an interesting one. Kanye West appeared at his, and the Conservative commentator Candace Owens appeared at the press show of his Yeezy collection, wearing White Lives Matter sweatshirts, as I'm sure you know, and the phrase has recently been used by white supremacist groups and has been categorised by the Anti-Defamation League as a hate slogan. Since then, he's doubled down on it. He's called Black Lives Matter a scam. I just wondered what your thoughts were on this developing situation.
I think that we've long had an issue. It's definitely happened in Britain, happens in America, where there's a dearth of black intellectuals in the public sphere.
Right.
And so for at least 30 years, we've been looking to black entertainers. Some who don't read. I'm pretty sure Kanye has said himself that he doesn't read books, which I don't begrudge people who don't read. Me, I love an audiobook. So because of a dearth of black intellectuals, black public intellectuals, which is a problem in itself. If you counted all the black female academics in Britain, they wouldn't be able to, they would under-occupy a plane or a bus.
Right.
It's a serious problem. So our media looks to black entertainers. I don't know if anybody remembers when Barack Obama was elected, I think BBC Newsnight decided to get Dizzy Rascal on
Did they call him
show to discuss
I think
it.
they called him Mr. Rascal, didn't they?
Yes, they did.
I loved it.
Again, speaks to a massive problem, right? To me, at the time, I said it's the equivalent of getting Jade Goody on, R.I.P., at the time she was alive, to speak about what's going on in the economy.
Yeah.
There's a phrase that conservatives use, which I think is apt here: the soft bigotry of low expectations. So for a long time, black entertainers, some of who they're not scholars in this topic, they're not thinkers on this topic. Of course, they're black, so they're going to have their own personal experience, but they have no chops in thinking around this topic beyond perhaps expressing themselves through their music. Society is reaching to them for serious comment and discussion and debate. And I don't want to be on race and racism in particular. I don't want to, do all black entertainers down. Of course, there are lots of really well-educated, thoughtful black musicians who are also thinking on this topic. But because of that soft bigotry of low expectations, and because for a good few decades now, our media has reached to black entertainers who really should not be speaking on this and should be staying on their lane, that's why he can do that, right? I often think that Kanye's political statements are garbled and incoherent, and I think that was a publicity thing that was successful,
Yeah.
I'm not going to try and deny his agency. I think that he's been speaking for some time about how he likes Trump, and he's been saying that for some time. So you'll have to forgive me for not taking it 100% seriously in the same way that I'm not asking a reality TV star what they think about the current cabinet, and I'm not trying to be snobbish about this. I just think that why is it, particularly when it comes to issues around race and racism and blackness, we're leaning so heavily on what black entertainers have to say. I just think it's racism.
Yeah.
I think it's racism that we're constantly looking to somebody like Kanye to have something profound to say on the matter.
It feels like it might be a good time for questions. Does that about the good time? I'd love to open it up for anyone who has any. Do we have a mic? I think we probably do somewhere. Yes, we do. Does anyone have any questions? Do not be shy.
I mean, if you don't, that's okay too.
Yeah, oh, there's one over there. Thank you. Oh,
Okay, but the mic is coming anyway.
I think that's working. Hi, both of you. I just was wondering, I know this is a horrible question for a writer, but what are you working on at the moment? And also, have you ever considered writing fiction?
I think I'm working on getting input, you know? There's been a lot of output from me for like 5 years. I'm bored of hearing my own voice, so I'm just getting input. I'm reading a lot, I'm thinking a lot, but I'm not currently under contract to write anything new. What was your other question? Fiction. Yeah, I don't think it's for me, really. I do like storytelling, but I enjoy to me, writing non-fiction, it's like looking at, making a story out of the facts at hand, creating even something that's chronological out of the facts at hand. So that's what I always lean towards. That's my inclination when it comes to writing. I mean, and also I think I've got pretty high standards for fiction as well. I love like amazingly well-written fiction, and I don't think I could be as good as some of my favorite fiction writers. So I'm just going to leave it to them.
anyone else? Oh, yeah, there's a lady in the back. Thank you.
Hello. Hello. When you are collating your input for your books, who do you look for inspiration?
This is going to sound quite strange. I was asked this earlier today as well. I don't really look to anyone. I don't look to any certain writers or anything. Instead, I'm just reading the news. I'm just taking it all in, you know. I need some clarification on the questions. Do you mean, when you say who, do you mean people? Do you mean places? Do you mean outlets?
Anything that you get inspiration from, where do you tend to look? Would it be people or environments or different places in the world? Where do you kind of find that real connection?
Well, I'm always reading. I'm a news junkie. I'm always paying attention to what's happening in the world. And then I'm often reading big picture analysis. I was always a reader of the FT, but now I'm like a close reader of the FT. I think what else am I doing? I'm listening to non-fiction and like reporting podcasts a lot. That's what I'm doing. I mean, I referred to listening to an NPR podcast and how subject matter about the bubonic plague suddenly clicked in my head. You know, it clicked for me, something that I'd been trying to articulate for a while, right? What else am I doing? I'm looking at conversations that people are having online and in person. I'm thinking about what our cultural neuroses are, what we're hanging on to at the moment. So yeah, I'm just really interested in everything. I don't know how else to describe it, really. Yeah.
I don't know where you find the time to write.
Oh, I don't write. I'm writing in my head, right. And then I'm like maybe taking notes.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm taking notes. I use the notes app on my phone a lot.
Right.
You know, that's where the writing goes. But I'm just synthesizing.
When you research the book, like the histories section, for example, like how, this is probably a stupid question, but how do you, there must have been so much material. Mm-hmm. How did you sort of filter that down to the few? I mean, although it's stuffed with information, that you chose to go with in that, for example?
This is another great question, and I need to bounce off that question as well, which is there was a lot of research in conversation,
Right?
So, and I still kind of do that today, right? Like I'm talking to people about current affairs. At that time I was talking to people in the activist community who were a couple of generations older than me, so I'd be seeing them at things and I'd be telling them, oh, I'm writing this book and at the moment I'm really interested in this period of time. And then they might give me pointers like, oh, well, why don't you look into this or why don't you look into that? A really great example of this is when I wrote about Hendon Police College in the book, and how in the 80s there was a lecturer who basically did a task with some trainee police officers and came up and found some pretty discriminatory views. So it just so happened that after some kind of event, I was in a pub garden and I bumped into an acquaintance who I knew had been involved in activism in the 80s. And I was like, oh yeah, I'm looking at this time period. And she said, oh, you should definitely speak to John Fernandez, who I ended up speaking to for the book, that sort of thing. So I suppose to broaden out my answer to your question, it's not just being a news junkie and, constantly paying attention to what's happening in the world, which is not something that I feel that I have to do or it's an obligation. That's just what I'm interested in. I'm also in conversation often with people who have broadly similar interests, not necessarily working on the same thing, but broadly similar interests, who at this point everybody knows that I'm a writer and that I like to go off and do my own reporting. So sometimes they come to me and say, oh, why don't you look at this or why don't you look at that? So again, it's about being in that community, which is something that I've craved a lot, I think, over the years, being in community with people with broadly similar interests and values, not necessarily in a way that we're trying to argue with one another or convince one another of anything, but rather just, again, it's like that input,
It's nourishment, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. But also, I don't really know how to describe it, but the more I see, the more I think, right? That's how it is for me. I'm always trying to see and read because it just gets the mind going.
Any further questions? Yes. Oh, there we go.
Obviously, the digital world has changed so much since 2014. So I was just wondering, how it's changed for you, obviously, as your profile's got bigger as well. And are you able to deal with it and turn off the noise?
Sure, I think that's a really good question. And it kind of links in with the other questions, actually, which is my answer is that I'm in those spaces on social media, taking in a lot, but similar to the ways in which I'm not under contract for a book. So I'm not producing. I'm also not sharing on social media anymore. I just literally don't post. But I'm paying attention to what everyone's talking and thinking about all the time. And it's all just going in. I don't know how to describe it. It's just, to me, again, it's fascinating because it's a window into what's important to people broadly and specifically, and it's an insight into those broader cultural trends and things like that. So in order for me to be able to navigate that, I feel that I can't get drawn into it. But I think that, and this is an answer to the last 3 or 4 questions, right? Which is, for me as a writer, I feel I have to take time and space to observe. I have to. And that observation is actually more important than necessarily being involved in the conversation, right? And I know that kind of sounds a bit strange because people are here in this room listening to me talk right now. But I don't feel drawn so much these days into contributing to the conversation. I feel like I'm in my listening stage, and sooner or later that will wrap up and I'll be like, I have something to say now. I've done a lot of listening and I have something to contribute. I mean, that's how I felt a little bit when I wrote the extra chapter for this, I did a lot of listening. In 2020 and 2021, there was a lot of requests and a lot of demand for me to emerge and say something, you know, because of the momentum that the book had been building during that time. And I was like, I'm not ready to yet. Like, this moment in time, this moment in history, this change is in flux. Like, I need to observe, right? I need to see, I need to watch. It would have been premature, I think, in June or July 2020 to emerge with something triumphant, you know? It was important to see how those conversations synthesized around our society and in our society at the time, you know? I always want to respond, I don't want to react. So, but in order to respond, like, it involves quite a bit of just listening. So I feel like that's where I'm at right now.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question. Thanks both for the conversation. And actually, if I may, it's a question to put to both of you. One thing that I think in the years since your book was released that seems to have developed is that so-called anti-wokeness has become legitimized as a part of the discourse. And I wondered whether that's still, you know, the white fragility that you describe, in the sense of refusing to recognize a problem framed in a particular way, or whether it's more a question now of accepting the framing in terms of structure and race and oppression, but then dismissing it. So to put to both of you really, would you agree, and what has been your response to seeing this emerge?
You want to take that? I've been doing a lot of talking. And then I'll respond, of course.
But
I like to listen.
Can I clarify, like, what sort of you think generally across society, it's more a kind of this is happening, so we need to respond, sort of push back against it, you mean? Or can you just clarify?
Yeah, so I think I don't think it's quite the same that if you take a Piers Morgan, for example, that an inability to sort of perceive a problem like as it is described to you in structural terms, it's like a total ability to perceive it.
Yeah,
But just a rejection of it, a willful rejection.
Yeah, or a willful sort of refusal to accept that that is acceptable. Yeah, that they can accept it. Yes. I think. Yeah, I mean, I think there is. Yeah, there's a vast range of views, obviously, but yes, and particularly someone like Piers Morgan is a good example of somebody who is taking a performative stance. I think there is a certain amount of that. That doesn't mean. I mean, Piers Morgan is not my mate. I don't know him or his views on a kind of, you know, in IRL, if you like. But I think there is definitely in the media a sort of columnist's instinct sometimes in some people to just choose a place to be and stick to it in a way that they're intelligent enough to know that that's not really the case, but that's what they're either required to write about or talk about because of whoever they're, you know, the outlet which they're writing or broadcasting for. That's what they want, or that's not everybody, of course, but that is the case in some cases, I think. It's quite, but I mean, not everybody, but there is definitely a performative kind of thing going on because, you know, the media is full of very bright people and the facts are there, you know, like you were saying earlier, you put the facts in front of people, but I think we're in a situation at the moment with the advent of the concept of fake news or alternative facts, which is such a nonsense. I mean, it makes no sense, but there are ways around. There are ways around the truth now. There are ways around facts. There are ways around seeing things, and people love to read that kind of fermenting rhetoric, I think, especially if they are feeling a bit defensive, which I think a lot of people, as you know, as you've written about, still are. But I think that is, in a way, a symptom of the fact that, as you were saying, lots of people's hearts and minds have been changed. So instead of just saying this is not the case, you have to find a way around the fact that it's genuinely the case. And I hope that what that means, I hope I'm making sense here, but I'm kind of trundling along. It means that, I hope that what that means is that they're sort of fighting against the wind, you know, and eventually the fact that people's hearts and minds have been changed means that they will have to move forward along with especially the young people and all that kind of thing. I hope that makes sense.
I'll tell you something that I was observing this week during Conservative Party conference. The think tank Policy Exchange, which is like a right of centre think tank, they held a online discussion. I watched a bit of it because, you know, I like to observe. And it was titled, "Are We Losing the War on Woke?" Which I thought was like super fascinating, you know.
Fingers crossed.
Me, I love to observe. You know, I follow GB News on Twitter. I like to know what's going on. I like to know what they're getting their knickers in a twist about. But I thought one of the people who was participating in that conversation contributed to the widely discredited race report. And to me, like, those links between that kind of discussion and the British government has to be focused on, right? Because the anti-woke position is co-signed by the British government, and it's a very buzzy, journalism-friendly conversation, and it happened under a prime minister who used to be a very successful journalist. Like, let's draw those links, right? I think it's really important, and that links into what you were discussing in terms of like that intransigent sort of like defensiveness. You know, it sells, it creates clicks and whatnot. But also, I'm not going to try and deny the people who take those positions. I'm not going to deny them their agency. I mean, if that's how you think or that's how you feel, then that's how you feel. But I think that, you know, the backlash taking place in Britain's broadsheets, and that like direct line between Britain's broadsheets and the Prime Minister under which that rhetoric flourished is very important to point out, because that wasn't happening under Theresa May. It wasn't. Actually, under Theresa May was actually trying to make, when she was Home Secretary, she was working specifically on things like disproportionate levels of stop and search amongst young black men. And she actually wrote an op-ed in The Voice, Britain's biggest black newspaper, on that topic. So what the rhetoric has actually become like super extreme under Boris Johnson in particular. That's really important to point out. And that's what I think differentiates this conversation from what people like to characterize as a culture war, because some of us are not backed up by the British government on this topic, you know? Like, some people's positions are backed up by the British government, and others, we're just out here, like, you know? And so it's that power differential that I always try to come back to. And on that power differential, I think, and this sort of links into your question about, you know, how I use or want to use social media these days, is I think since my book's come out, I've been on the receiving end of many invitations to step into the role of the adversary to those conversations. I mean, I've been invited to come on to fight out with Piers Morgan on national television numerous times, like over the years. First when he was on Good Morning Britain, and then after he walked off on Talk TV, you know. And every time I say I draw my own personal boundaries in the same way that I tried to draw when I wrote that original blog post, which is that, to me, this is not a performance. Like, to me, this is not about puffing up your chest on TV and inviting viewers to participate in the spectacle of the boxing ring. Like, this is about real life, you know. This is about people's life chances. It's not entertaining to me. And I think part of the anti-woke offering is spectacle, is entertainment, is watching certain men get red in the face and shout and beat their chests on TV and deliver long monologues about how the world's going to the dogs. And I have been invited to participate in those spaces, and I say no, not because I don't feel that I can't debate with them, but rather that I want to have this conversation in a way that doesn't reduce it down to ding, 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 boxing match, we're all fighting it out, because I actually think it's too important. But I also think that structure is one that Britain's very comfortable with. It's in the debating union, you know. Every position is to be fought out through the power of rhetoric and public speaking. And that's actually more, I think in Britain, we sometimes think that like rhetoric and public speaking and being able to be a good debater is more important than the facts of the matter. And so I said to myself, I don't want to engage in that way. You know, you're not going to find me on TV yelling about whether racism is real or not. There are lots of other people who do that, but I'm personally not going to do it because I wrote the book to be able to invite somebody into my mind for a day, right? Not to have that fight. And I do think that anti-woke is about spectacle. I do think that we're seeing that in Kanye's Paris Fashion Week spectacle. I think that we see it in monologues. I think that the advent of our new right-wing television stations in Britain, both DV News and Talk TV, part of that is about delivering monologue. Here's so-and-so's 10-minute rant about X, Y, Z, right? I also think that there's something like inherently like patriarchal about that like way of engaging with current affairs. Does it not just remind you of being at the family party and now Uncle so-and-so is going to go on for like 45 minutes and he wants to hold court? You know, I come to this work from feminist values. It's about collaboration, you know, and it's about lending your ear to people that you don't hear that often. Not about listening to Uncle so-and-so give his 15-minute rant about something he's very ill-informed about. So
It's just a pub bore situation, isn't it?
Uncle
really?
Uncle so-and-so. Yeah. So that's my the spectacle, the entertainment. But I think that's feeding into that's like a broader thing about politics that's happening across the Western world now, where it feels less about real lives and it feels more about ideology at all costs. I think the markets are now agreeing in the last 2 weeks, but yeah.
Any further questions? No? Thank you very much, Reni. That was brilliant.
Thank you everyone for
Thank
coming
you.
out.